because we can't go to the theatre, we're deprived of theatrical dialogue in all its senses. So I thought I'd do some interviews with British playwrights about their work to keep thinking about theatre, writing, and the world. I'm really excited to introduce to you today one of the most thrilling writers to emerge in the last decade, Alistair McDowall. How to characterise his work? I would say it's very characteristic of his work is dark, driving narratives, but also a kind of mashup of genres. So gritty urban realism will be mixed with elements of horror or science fiction. His plays are textually playful, they're theatrically inventive, they're often very, very funny, and also terrifying. I've often been scared in the theatre, but I've been scared by two plays by Alistair McDowall, Pomona and X, both of which gave me moments of genuine fear and dread in the theatre. His early play, Brilliant Adventures, which was a co-production, opened at the Royal Exchange Manchester and at Newcastle's Live Theatre. It's set on an estate in northern England, but then it completely defies conventional genre expectations to become a kind of mind-bending time travel play. His play Captain Amazing, which is a wonderful, wonderful play, is about a superhero, and it genuinely is about a superhero, and it's very funny trying to genuinely imagine the life of a superhero, but it's also and really a play about a father and his daughter, and it's heartbreaking as well. His breakthrough play was Pomona, which opened at the Orange Tree Theatre in Richmond and then transferred to the National Theatre and then on to the Royal Exchange. It's a brilliant, dark dive into a world of out and out urban horror. But it mixes that horror with elements of the thriller, elements of realism, comedy, role-playing games, and more. And it does it in a completely convincing way. For me, it was the play of the decade. And if you want to read it, my own edition of the play is, I thoroughly recommend to you. Since then, he's given us X at the Royal Court Theatre, and at the same theatre this year, All of It, which is a bravura, high-intensity, high-velocity monologue that tells the story, the entire story of one woman's life. Next month, again at the Royal Court, we were supposed to see the premiere of The Glow, his new play, but that, of course, has been postponed because of the health crisis. It's a wonderful thing, I think, to come across a new writer who appears to have emerged so fully formed. And I'm always beyond excited to find out what that kind of writer does next. So it's a real pleasure to talk to Alistair McDowall. So, Alistair McDowall, good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
How are you finding lockdown?
Well, I've had a small child, so I'd be in lockdown anyway, I guess. I don't know. How's anyone finding lockdown? Just one day at a time, isn't it? I guess it's this strange, entirely selfish moment, which might be interesting to talk about, is I find myself being slightly envious of people talking about all these amazing film marathons they're doing and all the reading they're getting done and stuff, and I'm just changing nappies and things, but
yeah,
but no, it's okay, we're all right, we're keeping well, and I'm trying to keep in touch with people quite frequently, which is helping things and stuff, but I'm not getting much, if any, work done really,
right,
or reading done or anything. I think I'm just on a sort of extended paternity leave really at the moment, but I'm doing all right. Yeah,
I was kind of emailing with James Graham, who was saying he's getting quite annoyed with that kind of meme that is, Shakespeare wrote King Lear when he was on lockdown.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
I go,
Yeah.
that's not encouraging. You go, oh great, so I've got to aim to write King Lear.
Yeah, ludicrous amount of pressure. Also, you could put me on lockdown for 20 years and I wouldn't write Lear. Like, it's not going to happen, you know. It's and then that's another thing. It's writers really, I guess, it's a slightly lesser break from daily life than it was, maybe, you know. Mostly sitting in my house anyway. So I think this pressure of you're going to write your opus now is daft, really. I think it's much more important to look after yourself in more basic ways at the moment than dump the pressure on yourself that I've got to write my masterpiece, you know. Silly, really, I think. I mean, do it if it's going to help you get through the day, but yeah.
So, of course, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, I guess a really relatively minor casualty, but of course, The Glow I was, in fact, I think it's the 9th of April, 2 months today, I was going to go and see it, 9th of June. So that's been postponed. I think the Royal Court's saying they are just going to pick up where they left off. Is that what you've heard?
I mean, that's what I've heard, but I'm not really putting money on anything right now, because who knows, everything's so in flux. But yeah, they told me they're postponing it, but you know, everyone's just playing it by ear at the moment, aren't they, really? But yeah, I mean, there's much bigger things to worry about at the moment. I mean, I'm also a lot luckier than other people. I already had a play on this year already, you know. I had one on in February, so I feel like I've got very little to complain about, to be honest, you know. So and gives me time to work in it again. I mean, I've been writing that play for forever, so I can tool away on it for a bit longer, I guess, you know. But I don't know, it'll emerge if eventually, like, you know, some form or another.
I wonder if there's, I don't want to make this sound more alarming than it should be. Is there a part of you kind of going, of course, you're writing a play for a kind of a slightly different world, you know?
Yeah.
The world after this. Who knows if we're going to have different priorities and attitudes? Does that come into?
Have I thought about that? No, I thought about just the more immediate sense of what it is going to be like after this, just day to day and work and getting paid and what my family are going to do and things like that. With the play, I mean, I guess if I think about it now, the play's set in the 19th century. So the 19th century will still be a thing, you know. That's not going to get wiped from the books, you know. So there's something. It was already slightly outside of time anyway, you know. But I don't know. I don't think people are not gonna want stories after this. It's funny because I've been asking my friends, like, have you been, you know, watching Dawn of the Dead and reading John Wyndham and stuff like this, or have you been, you know, going the opposite way to that? And I know some people have just been mainlining apocalyptic stuff. Whereas I've been, you know, I mean, I have very little time to do anything right now, but the little I have been reading, I've been reading like poetry, and I've been reading like William Carlos Williams and Norman McCaig and people who are, and particularly those poets who are writing about like nature and spring and stuff like I'm reading about flowers and the air and fields and things like this, you know, and that's providing me with some level of comfort, is just before I go to sleep reading about a breeze across a plain or something like that. I'm not too interested in reading about people stocking up on tin food and bolting the doors at the moment, you know. But I don't think, I mean, I would have thought fiction, in who knows in what form, that's going to be pretty safe, whatever, you know what I mean.
So I want to ask if some more general questions about the ways you write and so on. Then we'll focus in on a particular play, if that's I suppose I wanted to ask, actually, this is a question that will test that whole idea, because this may not be a question with a generalizable answer. But I suppose the question is where your plays typically begin, whether they start with thing you've read, or an image, or a line of dialogue, or a character, or something else? Do they typically start in a certain way, or do they come from different places?
Where do I get my crazy ideas from?
Mhm.
I don't. I mean, they never come from anything as specific as something I've read.
Mm.
They usually, some of them, they've come from slightly all over the place, really. I mean, some of them have come from a character turning up in my head, and then that's been just, I have to work out what their story is and follow. I just sort of feel like I'm following their lead, really.
Mm.
So people who've turned up quite fully formed. So, like this character Gilda, who's the sort of lead in X, the space play,
Mm.
she just showed up. And in this time machine one I wrote called Brilliant Adventures, it was those two brothers. So, but then in other cases, it's been a mood or a tone or a sort of color, or I mean, this play I did, Talk Show, I think a lot of that came from Loudon Wainwright's songs. I was listening to a lot of his music, and I was like, oh, I'd love to like write a play that like felt like these songs feel, you know, kind of
Mm.
slightly acidic, kind of bittersweet folk songs, you know. And I kind of, so they come from sort of all over the place. In terms of the glow, the as aforementioned postponed glow, that was just like an image of this woman, and I just felt like then I was sort of chasing that. So it's never as, I've never like read an article or heard about something from someone else or something, and I don't think my brain thinks like that. And anytime I've tried to write a play like that, it's never worked. I've always been slightly envious of people who can do that, because it
Right.
just like it, and I'm sure this isn't the case, but obviously from the other side of a fence it feels like, oh well, you can just go looking and then you'll find the thing, you know. Whereas for me it does feel like I'm sort of waiting for something to blow in on the breeze a bit, really, you know. um
And when you say you used a couple of kind of images of what happens next. One was sort of, you had to, I think you were saying the two brothers came into your head and you had to kind of figure out what their story was. And then
yeah
you also said, I think you had to chase an image.
yeah
So and what actually in practical terms is going on? Are you thinking a lot about that? Are you trying to write it out? Are you?
yeah It's really peculiar. And I think uh as I've got a bit older, I fluctuated between being very frustrated with that process and wishing it was different, and sometimes being able to be slightly more zen about it and just go, it will come, you know. Although those moments are slightly fewer and far between, really. But I think what it looks like is probably, it looks like I'm not doing very much, really. I mean, it's almost like trying to remember the lyrics to a song that, you know, you sort of know. You're like, oh, and then I think, but you're not allowed to Google it, so you're just sort of wandering around and then I think it's blah, blah, blah. No, it's not that. And I mean, I've said this before, I think a bunch of places, but the sensation that I have when I know I'm on the right track isn't creation. It's like finding. It's like finding. Uh, my overused analogy of, I found my keys, because your keys are always they always make sense where they are when you find them, or your wallet or whatever, because you put it there. You know, you're like, oh, of course I put it there, and I never have that great an explanation beyond that, which is, I remember with Adventures, this play with the time machine, it's got a time machine in it. I wasn't like, oh, and I'll put a time machine in it. It was just, oh, these brothers, and he's got something in a back room somewhere. I don't know what's going on. He's invented something. I think he's made something, and it's like, oh, it's a time machine. Of course it is, kind of thing. And then I realized after the fact, usually, that I've just been stringing together a bunch of subconscious stuff. And when I look at the plays now, I can see them as being sort of amalgamations of how I was feeling at the time, what I was reading at the time, who I was spending time with, what I was worried about at the time, what the sort of world felt like at the time, things like that. They look like, you know, it's like looking at a photo album or something. Um, but in the things I can do practically, I don't know, just to give something that is of some use, is like, I don't feel like I can come up with a play or an idea but I do feel like I can put myself in situations where they might be more likely to arise, basically. So I can, go for walks, I can listen to music, and in particular, I can try and, my biggest fear is losing my curiosity. I think particularly for men, it seems like you hit a certain age and then it's like, I just know. So, the classic thing of, you speak to someone of an older generation who's just like, oh, I don't know about that. I'm not interested in that. That's not my thing, or whatever. That's not.
Right.
Yeah, that's not. It's a massive generalization, but I think it's also partly something to do with maybe where I come from and stuff like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I do have a big fear of becoming just like, oh, this is the area I'm interested in, and everything else I'm not going to put any time in particularly. So I do spend a lot of time just trying to read people I haven't read before and go, oh, I don't really know much about, I don't know. I try to think what the most recent thing was. I was like, I don't know anything about black metal. I'll listen to black metal for a while and see what that's all about, or, I get, I've been reading a lot more poetry than prose recently. And it's just because I always felt like I was slightly underread really with that. So, and these are things that seem like, the romantic life of an artist, just sitting around and reading. But I do think it is part of my work really, is that you're just putting as much stuff as you can in the blender,
Yeah.
But I don't really have like exercises or, I know a lot of writers who'll start with exercises or do a thing or whatever. And I actually start writing like really late. Right. And it's a lot of just sort of mulling and wandering around, and I'm trying to sort of tune into a certain kind of radio frequency, and that can sometimes be really quick, and just sometimes it can take just like forever and ever and ever, really long time.
And you keep a notebook for each play, or is it all in your head?
No, I do. I wonder if there's one here. I don't think so, actually. I do. And some of the plays are quite a lot of notebooks, but I do that slightly later. I start off just carrying it around, and just because it feels almost, I don't know, if it's like a gas or something or a smell. It's not something that has any kind of physical form at first, So I just sort of let it exist in that sort of dream state for a bit and think about it a while, and then I'll keep notes on my phone. Just because it's to hand, which is dangerous because I lost a phone once and it had like 6 months worth of notes in it. It's not advisable. So I have my phone, and then I'll have the notebook a little bit later, usually when I feel like there's something slightly more concrete, I think. And some of the plays get loads and loads of notebooks because eventually I'll start writing very early bits and pieces in the notebook. Like I try and do as much work rough as I can, because I used to start typing quite quickly, but around the time of X, the space one, that was the first one I wrote by hand, like entirely front to back. And that one I did a lot of stuff in notebooks, because I just started feeling like, I think it was something to do with, by that point I guess I was reasonably-ish established, or to a certain point, I guess. And as a result, suddenly every time you're writing a play, you're like, oh well, this is going on, it's a commission, or someone's and there's there's all these extra pressures, where it used to be I was just writing plays because I liked to write plays, so I was trying to recapture that as much as possible. And the way I found easiest to do that was to write in really beat up shitty notebooks, and try to keep it a sandpit for as long as possible, because I just figured as soon as I started typing out a play, it just started looking like a play, and as soon as it looked like a play, I was judging it as a play rather than as work or notes or whatever, so so I do a lot of notebook work and scribbles, and you can't really. I mean, what's this? Just piles of shit like this, you know. It's just endless as well. I'm quite bad environmentally when I'm writing as well, because it's just scribbles everywhere, you know, everywhere.
Do you talk to other people about the play, or does it?
Never, never, ever. No, I mean, I just find it awful and humiliating, because it just seems such like I think also I still feel like being at school and doing my sort of creative things quietly, you know what I mean? And not letting anyone, you know, it still feels like that to me, because also, if I tell someone what I'm working on, you know, because I guess probably because I've got a fragile, I mean, the only response you want from someone is, that sounds incredible and amazing and you're a genius, you know. And that's the only, if you get anything, if you even get like, oh, good, or, oh, well, I'll read it, you know, it's not, I just immediately fall into, oh, it sucks and I suck and I shouldn't. The plays that I've told people about have always fallen to pieces, and it always feels like taking bread out the oven too quick or something. It's like, it's not, it's not fit to stand up on its own yet, you know.
So sorry.
I was also just going to say that the only reason I'm writing plays is to tell people stories. So if I've already told someone the story,
right,
it's all going to be like, well, what's the point in writing this? Like, that's the exciting thing for me, is delivering the thing and, you know, hoping they get something out of it, you know.
But does that also mean that you have never or would never do a kind of development process, like, you know, you go to the National Studio and you work with actors for a month and you write?
Yeah, I think I would do that. Yeah, I never get asked to do stuff like that as well, because I think, I mean, this is I think because I've written plays that are very knotty narrative wise, like they have very you know, twisty plots and things, I think I kind of ended up in this situation where everyone just sort of let me get on with it, and then I'd show up with a play.
Yeah.
Which is great, but I would love to do, like, I'd love to work with I'd love to do a piece of dance or something, or like I'd love to do something slightly different. And the main reason that is, I think the glow of this play, which is now happening, who knows whenever, that felt like the last one of a sort of mode for me. I sort of feel that was my last sort of big story gymnastics one. And then all of it, the one that was on in February,
yeah,
which is more of a poem almost, that feels like me trying to find strike out in some way different and do something that's as linguistically acrobatic as my kind of structures have been and stuff like that, you know. So no, I'd love to do more collaborative stuff and things like that, but yeah, I just generally I don't get asked to do a lot of that stuff, I think, and I think it's because my plays they've been sort of quite, I don't know, authored in quite a sort of traditional sense, I guess. They're very story driven, you know.
Yeah,
which is something that, you know, you can do in a group, but I couldn't have done any of the ones that I've done with other people. They're such private sort of puzzles to me, almost, you know.
And this is an odd question, but so you've been writing plays for 15 years, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote my first one when I was 16 at school. I used to make people at school do them and stuff. Yeah.
But what would you say you've learnt about writing plays?
What about it? And that's a, I mean, it'd be a very long list of bullet. I mean, I guess in sort of the bigger, more elemental ways, I think the most I learned, the quickest I learned, was when I was doing stuff on the fringe. And after university, I did a lot of plays in like pubs, and you know, I seem to always be on a train with like a bag of weird props or something, you know. And so I think I learned an enormous amount then, because it was so, you learn in such practical terms, because firstly, if someone's paid like £4 to come and watch your play upstairs at a pub, if it's not very good, then they will just leave. Like they'll just leave, you know. So that was the most basic thing, and just learning about sustain of action, and you know, and what is required in a live setting, you know. And the other thing that I'm really grateful for that time as well was, I was basically looking at what I had, you know, like a handful of friends who were actors, and, you know, no money and stuff. So I was writing very pragmatically, like, I'll write a two-hander for these two specific people, and it doesn't need any props. So I've got this one prop, I can use that to do that, you know. Or I want to write a play that I can take everywhere, so that, you know. And it was great because it meant you had to focus in so clearly on just the basic stuff, like, you know, character and story and things like this. So, but then when I got tired of writing on that scale and wanted to branch out and go bigger, I felt like I had really sturdy building blocks, because I just spent a lot of time. I mean, one or two of those plays I did on the Fringe, I must have watched upwards of 80 times, something, you know, nearly 100 times or something, just doing them endlessly to tiny audiences of people, and just being aware, like, this one, and knowing when the dips were coming, you know, or this scene's not very good, or this is the point where everyone starts to sort of cough and kind of look at their watch or whatever, you know. So I felt that then when I started branching out into kind of longer stuff and more complex stuff, I had such a firm standing in, you know, what a room of people feels like, all facing the same direction, you know. I think that was the biggest, quickest amount of learning I did, I think. I mean, really, really fast. And the other thing I also thought I learned was that, you know, when I was younger, I just used to think it was just such an achievement to like make an audience cry, and actually it's like really, really easy to make an audience cry. It's like really easy. And what's actually difficult is to make an audience cry and they're not really sure why they're crying. And I thought that was something that with the last couple I've occasionally tried to sort of nudge into. It's like, can I kind of bypass the sort of you know, to do something that's almost more musical? It hits you on a more, you know, elemental level. You know, I've said the word elemental too many times, haven't I? I've got slightly, I mean, I'm going to have to apologize. I'm going to be slightly rambly, and because I'm not sleeping very much, obviously, at the moment.
That's fine. One thing I always think is really, really interesting about your work, and quite distinctive, is the way that sort of the texts themselves, almost like as objects, feel like they're doing very specific things for different types of reader. And I mean by that, I think there's the director who obviously has to read it, and they've got a whole set of things that are kind of for them. And then there's stuff for the actors that they kind of go, wow, what are we going to do with that? And then there's also stuff for just the reader.
Yeah.
Going to get out of the library. And I kind of wonder, I think maybe this would be a good point to talk about X, actually. I hold up my prop.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
As you know, that I think is a great example of a puzzling text that makes you think, oh, I want to do stuff with this, but
Yeah.
I don't know what my relationship is. That I know is something you're quite conscious of.
Oh man, I spend so long doing the you know, the editing of the text before it gets published and stuff. I mean, I have to give big props to Methuen, because they're always very supportive and patient with me. And I think a big reason of that is I didn't grow up anywhere where I could really go to a theatre, and certainly if I couldn't see new plays. And my first exposure to, you know, Sarah Kane, Pinter, whoever, was reading them. And so I really appreciated it when I felt like that there'd been effort put in just for the reader, you know. Like I really loved that. And so I loved Dennis Potter as well, because there's quite often like sort of jokes in his stage directions or sort of asides, you know, like I liked that kind of connection, that he was aware that people were reading it. It wasn't just like a sort of schematic that was meant to just be sort of then put on a stage, you know. It existed in its own right. And even things like I think in Motortown in Simon's play. I remember reading that, and there's like a scene where someone's got a gun, but it's not immediately. They only mention the gun at the end of the scene, and it's not mentioned in the stage directions or something. And just the fact of just leaving it out, it just means that if you're reading it, you get this little kind of surprise, kind of, you know.
Yeah.
And I really loved that because I just thought it just felt, I don't know, welcoming and intimate. It felt like, you know, you were being cared for, you know. And so I like to do that, and I like to try and make the text, I mean, without taking the piss, because it has to still be a you know, a document that people can use practically, but I try, and if I can in the book, make the text somehow performative as well, you know.
Yeah.
So like X, there's the bit where suddenly they're just saying X all the time, and in the original document it's just like one side of A4 or whatever, but when we were editing the book, I just made sure that there was a point where you would have to turn the page and there'd just be a wall of it, you know, because I just thought that was really fun, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because so no, it's nice that you noticed that, because yeah, I do spend a lot of time doing that, and I do when I run groups and things. One of my boring teachery things that I say is, you know, people are going to read it first. It's not good enough to me if it's scruffy and all over the page and things. Like, you have to put a bit of effort in, because if you can't engage a reader, then that reader's not going to put it on, you know.
Yeah,
it's just fact, you know. So no, I do spend some would say a slightly obsessive amount of time on stuff like that, you know.
And I think what's also interesting, though, this in a sense, this is, you're part of a kind of a big, much more sort of 21st century trend of doing this, is also writing those stage directions that you know, clearly a director and designer on one level are going to go, well, how the hell do you think we're going to do that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if looking at X, you know, a gigantic nightingale lies on the floor, injured, bleeding. Gilda appears the size of an infant next to it. She shrinks from the bird's laboured breathing. Hands begin to push from within the bird's chest. A swallowed figure wrestling out from within the flesh. And clearly there's a sense in which there's a provocation in that, isn't there?
Yeah.
It's not just kind of naively going, oh, I just thought you'd just have some trickery.
No. Yeah, it's, I don't know if I'd write a direction that was a provocation. I don't know, but it sounds slightly wordy to me that these days, but like, and very specific. But I mean, that's also reading stuff, like, you know, reading Cleansed or whatever when you're a teenager, and there is something really freeing about it. But I do think there's a bit of a line, because you can suddenly veer into just writing, just going completely OTT, and I do think you have to take responsibility. And I think even the most bizarre stage directions I've done, I think I always feel like I have to, in my head, have at least a vague idea. If someone put a gun to my head and I had to do it myself, I'd be able to do it somehow, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm banking on someone having a more interesting take on it than I would. But I do quite like the giant bird in that one, because whenever I've gone and seen it, it's always been very different. And I like, particularly if they like make a bird. I went to see it in Korea. I went to see it in South Korea, and the guys after the show, they came and they were like, "Did you like the bird?" Like, it was like the first thing they said. They were like, "Do you like the bird?" So it clearly cost like half the budget to make this fucking bird that they had to drag on, you know. But it's, I think that's, theatre is like a purely metaphorical space. And
Yeah,
I mean, I've said this too many times as well, but I do think I'm trying to write how things feel, not how they are. And so the stage directions, to me, they should feel like that. They don't necessarily have to literally be that, you know, but they should feel like that.
and this kind of relates to that, but and this might again seem like an odd question, but how far do you think you understand your plays?
I don't know. I mean, the problem is as well is they get kind of blurry in the they're sort of all slightly amorphous blobs in my head, and when I think about them casually, I'm very, very fond of them and proud of them. But then whenever I look at them close up now, I find them a bit, I kind of find myself wincing at lines and things like this, like they, which is as it should be. You shouldn't be playing back your old demos and going, yeah, this is great. I achieved everything I needed to on this. Like they should be on some level slightly awkward to revisit, I think. But as to whether I understand them or not, I mean, I feel like I get to understand. I feel like I understand them after the fact. Usually, when I was quite young, a director just said, you have to know why you're writing the play. When you're writing it, otherwise it won't be good or whatever. And I remember thinking that was a lot of pressure because I didn't feel like that. And I still disagree with that because I just think I only realize after the fact, really. And I don't often. I always sort of have an inkling of what they're about, but it doesn't crystallize for me until a bit later, really. And I think if I did know really firmly what they were about, I don't think they'd be as interesting because I think I'd just be writing to that. I'd just have decided it's about this and this is. Whereas for me, when I'm writing them, they're so purely just about the people in them and about the sort of experience theatrically is what I'm really thinking about. What's this going to be like in a room, and who's, what's going on with this person? Where are they taking us? That it's only later that I start to realize, oh, I guess thematically it's this, or I must have been particularly worried about this at the time or whatever, but I feel like I don't feel like they've got too many secrets from me, to be honest. Although sometimes I have to go and watch one of them or revisit one for one reason or another, and someone's pointed something out and I've like totally forgotten about it, or I don't it's all very strange, and they're slightly like dreams to me now, and I mean the weird thing as well is you might have to edit this down now because I'm just going off on a rambly tangent, but like I don't know if you feel this about yours, but like the ones that I still haven't managed to write, or they sort of fell to pieces, or they're half finished, or I never got round to, in my head it feels very clearly like there's just a bunch of people just stood at a bus stop, like, and they're just sort of wait, like they're just sort of there. Right. It's like a really clear sense of people who I've sort of let down in some sense, like I haven't got them to where they needed to be. Right. And I think that, which sounds unrelated, is probably the key to how, understanding them or not, is I feel very beholden to all the people in them. I feel like I have a big responsibility to them, which is bizarre because they don't exist. I've made them up, but I do feel, I feel like I don't want to let them down. And when the writing's not going that well or the scene's not good, I'm just like, I've really led this person into a bad corner here, or this is not where they need to be, or I feel very apologetic about it, which is very peculiar because I don't think about it very romantically in ways other than that, really. Like, right. It's not I don't buy into a lot of the romance about writing, and particularly playwriting and things like that, but I can never explain that, is that they do seem quite real to me, and in a sense that I do feel quite beholden to them,
I think that's really interesting, and I always kind of think there are certainly things I do understand because I've figured out what's going on.
Yeah.
And there are other parts of a play where I kind of go, I have to kind of just trust that, and I'm not going to investigate it.
Yeah.
And I suppose I kind of think, I think you may completely feel differently about this, but the X in X,
yeah,
it's like one of those things where I go, if I'd thought of that play, and obviously I didn't write this play, but I would go, X clearly could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah.
So I don't want to sit there and try and work out what it really means, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I guess in that sense, I mean, yeah, definitely. They're in the process of writing, because as I said, it's dredging things up from the subconscious or whatever. Like, there are all kinds of things where I'm thinking, I don't quite know why I need to go in this direction, but I just sort of have to right now, or I don't quite know why this is in there, but I just know it has to be.
Yeah.
But then I take you back to the same thing about responsibility. I don't feel like I finished the place thinking like that, because I think I have to take responsibility for everything that's in there. And I think if I'm too dreamy and like, oh, hey, who knows, it's that seems like there's a difference between something that you've made a decision not to know about and something that you just haven't bothered to investigate. You know what I mean? Like, and I think there are definitely things in those plays, I guess, like the X, where I've made certain decisions not to inquire on every level, and I've just trusted that there's some sort of untapped depth in there. But at the same time, in the writing of that play, I knew very clearly in practical terms what I was doing with just having this letter just recur and then take over the whole play. Like it was very, I mean, and this is another thing, is in terms of ambiguity, which I talk about working with people in workshops and stuff like that, is like, I always feel, I mean, people might disagree with this, but I have to know the answer when I'm writing a play. I have to know the absolute defined answer to everything. Because then I can just decide not to tell the answer, basically. But if I don't make a choice on the answer and I'm just like, hey, it could be either, then it'll basically be neither. And I'll just be sort of traipsing through this sort of vague, desert where there's sort of, oh, it could sort of be anything, Whereas, so for example, I guess in this one I did, the Pomona one, which it's got two characters who might be one character, or maybe they're two characters, right? There's like twins, and maybe we see one or the other, or maybe both, and what have you, I don't remember now what the actual decision I made was about that. I don't remember, but I know, because I remember very clearly, I remember the walk I had when I was thinking about it, that I knew exactly the specifics of like, no, it's definitely this. I just won't reveal it, but it is definitely this, because otherwise that doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense, or whatever, And if you make that decision, then suddenly it's always the same thing with writing. It's like people are worried that if they close off certain roads, then they're gonna lose things. Whereas actually, if you just refine what you're doing, you open up so many other opportunities to things, So I knew exactly the answer to kind of the question in that play. I just never revealed it. And then luckily, eventually, you just sort of forget, because, because it's not, since it's not revealed in a play, you never, it just sort of fades out eventually,
So and again, talking specifically about X, kind of, do you remember where it started?
Yeah, I was writing about, I wanted to write a play about this woman, Gilda. So the play was originally called Saint Gilda, and it was about her and her daughter. And I couldn't get it right. It was sort of a bunch of different versions of it. I kind of tried and failed it like 3 times, and it was always about them either leaving home or being evicted from home or not being able to get home. And it was about a sort of distance between their home and between each other, basically. And it just never, I couldn't make it work. And then eventually I got so sick of it, I was like, oh, I'm just going to try this other thing, because I'd had this other idea of doing this play set on Pluto about people who just get trapped on Pluto. And then I realized, oh, it's the same thing, because if I put these characters that are in a story about being very far away from home on Pluto, then suddenly everything sort of fires together. And I mean, that's another thing, is a lot of the plays have been originally, I thought they were 2 plays, and it turned out they were 1, So with that, it was, and then the weird thing with that play is obviously her daughter, she's in the play, but we don't know it's her daughter until like way later. It has this kind of bizarre kind of puzzle framework to it, So it kind of transformed in a really strange way. But saying that, the character is still the same as she was in all those other weird kind of versions of that play,
Right.
Which is kind of peculiar, but which is another thing that I guess proves that I'm not just throwing in, oh, I'll do it in space, or I'll shove a time machine in, or a monster, or whatever. It's always very much about the characters and the emotional kind of tapestry that's going on, really. And that, you know, usually all these slightly idiosyncratic elements, they emerge because I'm trying to, you know, realize an emotional landscape rather than a kind of literal, you know, realism landscape, you know. So so no, that's where that one, it just kind of came from her. I mean, there are other things like Clark and Ray, who are two of the characters in it. They're named after people I used to work with. I worked in an art gallery for a long time, for like 3 years. And because I also feel like that play is almost like a work play as well. You know, like you know, David Story used to write, Wesker and people like that, in a weird way. I mean, people wouldn't think so because it's set in space, but like the stuff we were talking about when we were making it was the cherry orchard, and you know, and I was talking about you know, the kitchen, and you know, the changing room, or these plays that are all just about people waiting for stuff, basically, you know, waiting for things to happen. And so there's a lot of stuff there about just being in a sort of slightly shit job, just sort of whiling the hours away, really, you know. But
sorry, it also, I mean, it's I totally get that thing about it being a work play, and actually there's a lot of it that is about boredom and people getting on each other's nerves, and also the mechanics of this base, you know, the girls, the oxygen and water systems and all that stuff. But of course, the other thing I think is really interesting about it, and I want to talk a bit about science fiction in a moment, but theatre is often not very good at science fiction. But I sort of, the thing I really liked about X is that it felt to me it really was part of that tradition of sort of like Event Horizon and Solaris a bit, and 2001 a bit, and there was that Doctor Who episode, The Impossible Planet, which I thought it's got some connections with it, and it felt like it's properly trying to do that sort of thing.
I mean, I always feel like I disappoint people when this comes up, because I had a very long, I'm not going to say argument, debate with Tim Foley about this, because he really is he is a sort of science fiction playwright in a way, you know, or at least sort of spread, you know. Whereas I mean, I think people just get wound up when I say this. I still don't think I've written a science fiction play, really. I mean, and I say that not because I'm denying it, but because I am a fan of the genre. I have read a lot of the stuff, and I sort of know, you know, what the sort of framework is. But you know, it's in space. I'm not a moron, you know. But I mean, the way I will speak, I mean, the thing about, so the thing about theatre and science fiction is that it always seemed to me, well, theatre is extremely well placed to do science fiction, because it's theatre is a coming together of people who imagine all at the same time. Audience and actors imagine all at the same time. And it's always just seemed weird to me that we've just chosen to imagine living rooms for this long, you know, like it's just, and it's not original. Like Carol Churchill's written science fiction plays, you know, and then there's, you know, Rossum's Universal Robots and all that, you know, where robot came from, obviously. They do exist. But I think the problem is that we associate the genre with its aesthetic, you know, with the surface stuff, you know, with spaceships and aliens and things, rather than what, you know, the people that I always really loved, who are writers in that genre, you know, people like Richard Matheson and stuff like that, who was just actually writing about, or Ray Bradbury or whatever, you know, writing about the idea. It just so happens that it was, you know, set in whatever year or whatever alternate world or whatever. Theatre is an ideal place for science fiction, you know. But saying that, X to me always just seems like more of just a psychological drama that happened to be set in space. I remember around the time that play was on, they were re-releasing all the Tarkovsky films, and they got, I think someone who was in charge of the project, they got in touch with me, and they were like, we're putting them out on DVD. Do you want to write some liner notes for one of the, because I think they saw it and were like, oh, this guy loves Solaris.
Right.
And weirdly, I've actually never really liked Solaris very much. Like, I love Tarkovsky, but I've never. That's like my least favorite of his films. And the one that there was an influence of his on this play, but it wasn't that film. It was Mirror, which is all about his mother and memory, and how kind of the shards of memory all sort of glance up against each other.
Mm-hmm.
And his book Sculpting in Time, which is also about just how time works in art, you know.
Right.
But the stuff that I was drawing on from that play, I was reading I think I was reading quite a lot of Conor McPherson's plays at the time as well, which I can see kind of quite cleanly in it. And then Joyce, the last bit of Molly Bloom's kind of section of Ulysses is basically half of the idea for the whole play in a way, really, right. Which is her saying this word yes, sort of, she's talking about getting engaged to Leopold Bloom, and it's like a stream of consciousness, and the word yes just sort of keeps kind of popping in almost like a virus, in a way that this one moment she said yes changed everything. And I thought, it'd be great to do that with a person, you know, with a character, to just have them be so world changing and loved that they were present even before they were, you know. And there was stuff like, you know, I'm one of four, and I would remember ringing home when I was at university, and my mum would answer her phone and be like, hello, Callum, Lizzie, Sean, Alice. Like, my name would be the last, you know, in the kind of in the list, you know. And it's stuff like that. I feel like that play, rather than spaceships and stuff, it was more tied into that. Like, how are the people that we love? How are they not just in our minds, but how do they structure our minds? You know.
Yeah.
And I knew Vicky was the right person to do it, because when we talked about the play, we weren't talking about 2001 and stuff. We were talking about terms of endearment all the time. We just kept talking about terms of endearment. And that was the real challenge, because if you do this play and go overboard on the space, it just kills it. And really, it does a similar thing, I think, with space that this other play, Brilliant Adventures, does with the Time Machine, which has like, they sort of dismiss it in about a page. They're sort of like, oh, here's the time machine. It just works. Just take it as read. This thing works. Now let's get on with the story. We're not spending like 40 pages kind of justifying the existence of this thing. And I think the same thing with X is like, we open on, they're just like eating cereal and shit, you know, around the kitchen table. And they quite quickly blow through quite a lot of exposition about it. But it does seem mostly uninterested in all of that stuff. And I think with a bit of jiggery pokery, I could have probably put that play under the ocean or in a desert or on the Arctic. I mean, maybe not, because there's something about Pluto as a metaphorical space which makes everything work a bit better. But it wouldn't be out of the question, you know. And I take your point. You know, it's weird that there's been so many science fiction plays in the last couple of years. You know.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I get that point entirely, because of course I can imagine if you had a kind of mega, you know, proper big science fiction set, then actually the ending is going to seem like a bit of a disappointment. You know, whereas actually the whole emotional drive of the play is heading towards that kind of revelation, that moment, the confusion and love of that, I think. But you mentioned time, and obviously time is one of the puzzles of the play, because there is one of the ways that the play works is that with successive scenes, you're having to reorder in your memory what story you think you've been. So a question I've got for you, a kind of practical question about how you wrote this play, is, was it very meticulously planned before you wrote it?
Oh, you know, Dan, it was a fucking nightmare, I swear. It was, I mean, and the worst thing actually was not the initial writing of it. That was bad enough, but the rewriting of it was such a pain in the ass, because every time I changed something, you know, changed the tiniest thing in scene whatever, then suddenly there was like 50 other dominoes, which is always the case with writing a play, but it was so pronounced in this one. And I was like, I'm never ever doing this again. And then the next one was sort of this one, The Glow, has sort of been even more of a nightmare, really. But it was very carefully planned out, and I wrote it all by hand to sort of ground it in a way, because I was worried I was just going to get sort of lost in it. And the other thing that I did, I mean, a partial inspiration for it, I think, was a couple of years before. I saw a play. I won't mention what it is because I'm going to slightly slag it off. I saw a play in America, and there was a point where we saw something happen, and then later on in the play, someone was talking about this event, and then I was like, oh my God, it didn't happen. They just showed us it, but it didn't actually happen. That's amazing. And then it turned out that wasn't the case, and I just sort of invented that in my head, kind of thing.
Yeah,
but
right.
I thought I'd never seen that, like just showing us the scene and then sort of denying its existence later on, which just seemed like such a fun game to play with an audience, you know. So then when this play came along, I was like, oh, that's the perfect, this is the tool that's going to help me write this story, kind of thing, you know. But which is a slightly, I guess, a sort of like a Rashomon kind of thing, you know, the sort of,
yeah.
we never quite trust what we're seeing. And but the other thing I did was, because it's all about memory and how much we can trust what happened or not, is there's all this stuff in it where I would have someone would say a line, say in scene 1, and then that line would be repeated in scene 3, but by a different character. And then I would have the line repeated again, but it would be like the same amount of syllables, but different words, or it'd be similar, but slightly different. So I did this thing where I was just sort of like, sort of dropping these little sparks all the way through the play, mostly in the first act, because my idea was, if I did that enough, you wouldn't notice it consciously, but your brain would sort of register it as a sort of just a rhythmic thing, like, oh, there's that line again, there's that thing again, you know. I think Lynch does like a repetitious thing. It seems like every character, like at some point in one of his films, someone will say, now it's dark, you know, like every one of his films, someone will say, now it's dark,
right, yeah.
And so I sort of was going really extreme with this and doing all these strange things with the words and and it was a complete waste of time, because no one can ever tell me if it worked, and you know, people won't notice it, and you know, it's like, it was such a huge amount of effort. But the idea being that I think it probably did work in a sense, because acts 1 and 2 of this play are very different. In the act 1, even though you realize later it's the time frame is slightly more complicated and there are things that did or didn't happen, it's still broadly scene, you know, in a room that we recognize with characters that progress. And then act 2 is where the sort of everything becomes like liquid, and it just sort of you know, it's like a mudslide almost, act 2. And I feel like some of that experimentation did work to an extent, because they shouldn't feel like entirely isolated, because actually all the stuff that's happening in act 2 is still happening in act 1. It's just under the surface and you don't see it. So really all that happens in act 2 is you sort of rip the hood off the car in a way, and you can see what was happening the whole time. It's like there's always been maggots underneath, we just didn't see them, you know what I mean? So just having these little sort of glances of repetition and things like that sets you up, hopefully, for then later on it just becomes this sort of, you know, spiral, you know, which it didn't work with some people. I remember sitting watching that play at the court, and the point where suddenly it gets to when they're just saying X loads of times. I mean, some people just did laugh, you know, some people just thought stupid, you know. It's like, because I think you have to sort of buy into it or not, I think. And I think if you've come along for the rides properly, that bit should seem slightly nightmarish and sort of really uncomfortable and like slightly nauseous and unpleasant, you know. But if you haven't, if you've not really bought into it, it just sounds like people saying X a lot for a long time, you know. Like it's like, and I do a lot of repetition. It seems like that's becoming a thing that I like doing, but it's because I think you can do it. It's something interesting that happens when you sort of just pick one phrase and just repeat it until the meaning sucks out of it, you know.
There's an interesting moment in the play where I think it's Clark says, I really feel like I'm clinging on by my nails here. And
Yeah,
I kind of think, I remember in the theatre thinking, yeah, you and me both.
yeah,
There's, because there's, but what I think is really interesting actually about the play is that there's a real fine line between over explaining it so the audience, you know, are absolutely led by the hand the whole way through, which you don't want to do, and then
yeah,
also completely losing the audience,
yeah, yeah,
which
yeah,
also you don't want to do. And you said, it was interesting earlier, you said that you sometimes you think of your past plays as a bit like dreams,
yeah,
uh, because I think some of your plays feel like dreams when I'm watching them, in that
yeah.
sense that, you know, kind of anything could happen. I can't really trust that there's any solid ground that, you know, that it isn't suddenly going to completely transform in my head. I mean, how did you navigate that
Yeah.
part?
I mean, that thing about there being no solid ground, I've never felt there was any solid ground in a theater anyway, you know. And I mean, like, it's such a tenuous, I mean, everyone has the same thought when they go watch a play, if you're attention drift, where you go, I could just wander up onto the stage right now and just go, hey, look at me, it's me now, it's the me show for a second. Or at any point one of the actors could just decide, I'm not going to do Hamlet anymore, let's do the Seagull now, you know. And just there's no guarantees at all, which is, you know, the sort of exciting thing about it. And I always think that plays that work well um, are somehow using all of what theatre is, not just using it, not just using the stage. You know what I mean? That you're actually thinking properly about what it is that an active theatre is. You know, but in terms of yeah, not getting to a point where it's just daft and no one knows what the hell's going on. Because I think that one and Pomona, they don't really have much. They're not that interested in whether you're following it every second, the plot.
Yeah.
Either of them, they're not really bothered. And that's not a case of me not doing my job, I think, because I think the thing I've always said, I think particularly with when people have done Pomona and they ask to talk to me about it before they do it or whatever, and I just quite often feel like I have to say, look, just trust that they'll get what's going on, that the information will dump in their heads. And actually the way I'm doing that, you know, how I'm riding that line as you defined it, is I just think, well, I'll just make these characters as clear and as human as possible, and I'll just make everything that they're feeling as true as I can, and to try and make the most simple character and emotional sort of landscape stuff really immediate. And you know, all my plays are quite peculiar, but the characters, I mean, there are some sort of weirdos in there, but they're all sort of slightly normal weirdos. They're all sort of people you would meet wandering around the street, you know what I mean? Yeah. They're not, I don't think, you know, they're not like, it's not like Wes Anderson or something who creating these sort of really, like, he's interested in creating these sort of slightly cartoony characters in a way, or, you know, characters like New Yorker cartoons or whatever. My characters are always, I think, reasonably grounded, and I think that's what drags people through. And I think with X, the big sort of cheat in it is that Gilda is basically the audience's ambassador, is because she spends most of the second half of the play going, I don't know what the hell's going on. And so the audience can go, well, you know, maybe we don't know everything either. Like, it's a real, so just making sure that everyone can lock into the human side of the story, because then I think everything else does follow eventually, you know. And also, you could write a really complicated play and make it super complex, and then spend all your time making sure everyone understood at every turn what you were doing, kind of thing. But ultimately, the characters aren't in any way interesting. No one's going to be bothered, you know. And I always thought that X tells, Pomona to an extent, but X more, I think, tells its story through emotional means. Even though it seems like it's very narratively driven, I think actually it's pulling you through emotional means. I think someone who had a big impact on me when I was, I don't know, a teenager student, Shane Carruth, this filmmaker, he's only made 2 films and they sort of never let him make another one. He made this film called Primer, and he made this film called Upstream Color, and they're films that the first time you watch them, you're just like, I have no clue what is going on here. but they're so compelling, and because he's much more interested in kind of pulling you through, emotionally rather than in literal terms, and I always liked that, and I think it's something that a lot of filmmakers have done quite a lot, like Bergman or whoever, and I think or Bresson, I think people who haven't liked my work have thought it was slightly more cinematic than it should have been, and I've always really disagreed with that. But I do think one of the things I have taken from film more than theatre is just feeling more free just to tell stories through that sort of emotional, unconscious language, dream language, rather than literally kind of plot and narrative, which is peculiar because I think the plays don't seem like that on the first glance, because they do seem quite, plotty, which they are. But I just, when you read a lot of plays from I guess particularly from the 20s or whatever, where people are coming into rooms and going, "Oh, hello, I just saw so and so down at the market, and he's been talking to the bank about what's," there's these kind of, obviously not like the greats, but there are a lot of sort of plays that spend an awful lot of time telling you what's going on outside the room, and X is weird, I think, in that it is a room play, but it almost entirely dismisses everything that is going on outside the room, just says there's fucking nothing outside this room,
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then last question I want to ask you is, you said right at the beginning of this discussion that, of course, you're not probably doing very much different from what you would have been doing anyway in lockdown. And of course, playwrights very often do work in a kind of lockdown, just beautiful weeks on end. So there'll be people who are kind of trying to use this opportunity to do a creative project. What's your advice for how to keep creative with lockdown?
Oh man, I don't know. I just think the same. I think the same rules apply, really. They're just probably more pronounced. I think if you're doing it for your own fulfillment, enjoyment, then you're on the right track, And anytime I've ever done anything that's worked out, it's because it was just something that made me laugh, or it's something that gave me some sort of solace, something that kind of, helped me. Whatever, I think anytime I've gone, I am going to write a play, it's always just been disastrous, and if I don't have one, I just have to accept I don't have one. It might be vaguely interesting. I have this over my desk. It's quite fun, isn't it, about lockdown? You get to see everyone's rooms. I'm a big Daniel Johnston fan, so I have all his tapes on above my desk. And I've got his signature up there as well, and I keep his stuff around a lot and sort of try and have it like visible, because I just think if people don't know who he was, he died recently, but he's a bipolar singer songwriter who sort of homemade these kind of cassettes of these songs, and mostly in the 80s, and he's very important figure to me because he just represents everything almost that's great about art, and that he didn't wait for MTV to come calling, and he didn't wait for success. He just did his thing, and he recorded in the garage, and then he made the tapes, and he drew the covers, and he just gave them to people, And I keep his stuff around a lot because I think, because theatre is quite a small world, and because it's a very social world as well, it's very easy to get all so tangled up in the things that are everything but writing your play, you know what I mean? And I think if you want to write a play right now, you should just do it because you think it would be something that'd be an enjoyable thing to do, rather than I'll write a play and then when this is all over, I'll be able to do X, Y, or Z or whatever, And I mean, that's the thing that's really hard to, when I've run groups and stuff, to talk about is, I've still, I've got a play or two in the drawer that no one wants to do. You have to be okay with writing things that might not happen. You have to be at some level willing to accept that it might end at it just being a script. Obviously you have to be pushing for it not to, but you have, because if whenever that happens, it just destroys you. You're never going to get out of bed again, you know. So it's this lockdown, I guess, is a test of that in a way. It's like working out why you write and whether you're writing for the right reasons, I guess, you know.
Brilliant.
Maybe.
Thank you.
Not bad ending, is it?
That's not a bad ending. Cheers. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, and see you when all of this is over.
Yeah.